My name's Lee Maxey, and I'm delighted to be here with a new podcast guest for the Mind Maxing podcast, Adolescence to Adulthood, with Dr. Mariana Amatullo, who's leading the Parsons Exec Ed at the New School. And I've known Mariana now, I think it's probably 3 or 4 years, and she is a truly global person. She's a world traveler and has a really good sense of, in my mind, a much broader perspective than just the U.S. Perspective of both education, but of things in general. The Adolescence to Adulthood podcast focuses on what happens as a younger person starts to move towards adulthood. And as we know, adulthood is not a specific age. So adulthood back in the 80s, as James Carnevale mentioned, was 25 for financial independence in 1983, and now it's 32. So when someone becomes an adult is a very flexible time. But I'm looking forward to talking with Mariana and welcome, and glad you could join us, and really want to start off with a first question around how is our educational system, how are educational systems in general, or how is education helping adolescents move to adulthood? So.
Well, it's great to be with you, Lee, and be part of this program and podcast. And thank you for that generous introduction. I think, this is such a large question, right? So we can break it up in different pieces, but we are coming out of this global pandemic and the forced experiment that I called this forced experiment of going remote. I think we're seeing new opportunities and new challenges connected to your question. But to start answering it, how are young people moving through education these days? It's very clear that the way they're learning and consuming information is so connected to the digital. These are, born digital learners. And so how learning is happening across multi-channels and devices, and the phone device, the mobile devices, how reading is happening, and how experiences connected to the social in education is happening. All of that is shifting and changing, I think, before our eyes. And there's a lot of opportunity, but also a lot of challenges connected to that.
Yeah, you mentioned the social, and I think that's actually something that I'll call it our educational structures don't necessarily embrace or haven't yet as much as I think there's opportunity there. What do you see happening around that? I'll call it peer network and sort of I learned this and sharing it with my social group as an adolescent or as a young adult.
Yeah. Again, a lot of new possibilities that are positive through social media and through things like all of the different platforms people are using to connect, but also a loss, I think, in some cases, right, of very basic skills that one has when you have the opportunity to develop those face to face. And there's a tension there that is very real. We are seeing, we've been seeing this in higher education in this country very before the pandemic, very concerning uptake of mental health issues, well-being issues, and the connection to isolation and loneliness that the pandemic has brought about, along with all sorts of socioeconomic issues, especially for more disadvantaged, vulnerable families, is very real. What I have experienced firsthand as a professor at Parsons teaching during the pandemic online, and also now teaching back in our studios and seminars in New York City with students, and these are graduate students, so they are a little bit more mature and have had much more experiences and expertise behind them by the time I'm working with them. But there's definitely, they talk about a sense of joy of being back together again, but also an adaptation happening after these 2 years of a lot of isolation. So I think we don't quite have a grip on all of this, and we're still working through it.
I know Parsons, has a sort of a, specifically unique, art, and the physical presence for studios has to be what I consider to be, benefiting from being back face to face that might have been hard to address in a remote environment.
Yeah, no, for sure. For sure, a lot of our disciplines are about making as much as about the intellectual inquiry that happens with other forms of learning, and there's been a lot of innovation, again forced innovation with the pandemic and needing to be online, but there are things that you don't replace, and it's just been fantastic to have our making centers full of students again.
So as students, whether they're in their late teens or in their early 20s, in their burgeoning career / first jobs, are trying to make that work for them, what are some things that are educational barriers or not as effective that institutions and or systems or approaches have made it more difficult or have
Yeah. Well, some of it is around scheduling and very rigid curriculum, right? Where you cannot advance if you don't, you have prerequisites, etc. For the student that is a working student, this can be, or that might be managing a young family. All of this can be challenging. So the flexibility of learning on their own terms, on their own time, that hybrid models and online allows, and the asynchronous synchronous sort of relationship allows. I think we're seeing an appetite for that for demographic of learners that have complex lives. That is not a barrier, is an opportunity. But barriers, I would say, continue to be, and especially in this country, huge barrier is access and the finances of our educational model in the United States. And then there are those work-life balance barriers that are real. Yeah.
We've just had our sort of quarterly all hands meeting as a company, and I'm particularly sensitive to the work-life balance stress that our team is under. It's really complicated these days, and to throw education and I know as a professor you're there to interact and expect those students to be present for what you're teaching, and yet there could be a lot of things going on these days because the blur is quite significant. The boundaries have been either erased or definitely blurred in terms of what time someone's working and what time the family's available, and I've just heard a lot of different stories about just people don't have the ability to carve out time to learn.
Right. And I think there's such pressure, right, around accomplishment, around completing a degree so you can move on to this or that, that sometimes inquiry, right, the process of learning and the process of inquiry, and this is especially true when you get to graduate level work, that there is a maturation in that happens intellectually, that you need to give it time, and you need to create a space for reflection and self-awareness. And that's not always easy to do, I think, for us as educators. But when we accomplish that, I think it then pays off for these learners, not only in that particular class or subject matter that they may be studying, but it has a halo effect, I would say, in other parts of their learning journey or learning arc. And I know that, again, as a professor who teaches leadership and innovation at Parsons, I focus a lot on these more sort of holistic dimensions of teaching and learning, whether it's online or on site, that I think are really needed for this generation today.
I think you bring up a wonderful point, and I see this with, I'll call it a Western culture, that spirit of inquiry rather than goal accomplishment. I think that spirit of inquiry, I think, is one of the greatest gifts of an educational space, or can be. And I don't know, in my life, I know that creating space and or time to do that it takes work, because deadlines and goals are usually what drives I'll call it my calendar, or drives my day, creating space for that inquiry, I think, is a true gift. But I think that's a hard thing to do. And I don't know that, like you were talking about that at Parsons, I don't know if that's happening in a lot of students' educational experience at that graduate age. So.
Right. And we're very focused on it, both at the undergrad and graduate level, and all the way through non-degree spaces, which I work on and oversee at the university. There's this beautiful quote, and I think it comes really from design mindset. There's this beautiful quote by one of the great theoretical minds of 20th century, Horst Rittel, who coined, the term with Max Weber, wicked problems, or problems that are interdependent and complex. But he has this quote that says, learning what the problem is the problem. And it's a very designerly approach, thinking about, that we really need to be asking the right questions, right, as a process of inquiry, to get to a goal, to get to meeting an outcome. And we definitely in design education, but also in the creative realms we teach, whether that's, the performing arts at COPA, the new school, or whether we're looking at our space in social science with a very critical and social justice lens. We're always deconstructing problems to ask the right questions. And that is a process of inquiry. It permeates our institution at the new school, throughout our 5 colleges. And again, it does necessitate time. And back to the earlier points we were making around people being very stressed and having the daily grind getting at them, that takes a toll in that ability to fly and be super creative.
So, looking forward, about how we know that there's going to be a drop in 18-year-olds going to college. That the demographics are changing so significantly. Mm-hmm. We're now at 60-40 female to male, and I'm seeing a potential drop in interest in master's programs. And I think that's going to continue based on what I'm taking in from information that I process. What do you see as how education is going to continue to support people in their movement to adulthood, and or what do you see as some of the futures of innovation in education?
Yeah, I think that, all the data that you're quoting, right, is showing those demographic changes. There's behavior and expectation changes from both the learners and from the employers, right? We know that with the digitalization of the world that we have, all the sort of World Economic reports and all of the workforce reports are showing this need for upskilling and reskilling and people transversing several jobs going forward. And so there's definitely in this marketplace of education, if we call it that, right, there is definitely all these important models that are no longer just the degree level model of the university, but all of these players being very successful, whether from the private sector or not, right? Taking on a piece of this pie to think about what learners want or need or will need. And there's a very important economics sort of landscape that now is become very very varied, I would say, and is really evolving rapidly, and are incredibly prestigious universities and key sort of places like us, with the #1 art and design school in the world, Parsons in the country, #3 ranked in the world. We're really paying a lot of attention to these things from also a perspective of serving and making our education more affordable, and thinking about questions of access and inclusion and social justice, and how might we create in the non-degree space pathways to the degree space that might foster that access and that inclusion. So I think we are seeing, if I go back to your question, expectations of learners that will want more than just one path towards education, smaller bites. We have seen, and you know this very well, all the stackable credentials and all of the micro credentials of conversation explode in the last few years. And I expect we will continue seeing all of that mature and get better and get stronger in terms of questions of accreditation and questions of pathways. And I think that all of that is quite exciting from a perspective of broadening choices for people to learn in their own terms when they need to do so. That said, I don't think our degree structures are going away anytime soon. They will be needed. But I also feel that, there is an opportunity for innovation in the delivery and the student experience, the faculty experience, and that we only have really scratched the surface in terms of making those online experiences more immersive and more social and truly truly exciting. There's a lot that's happening, and there's more that will happen coming our way.
Yeah, I love the comment on pathways, and I'll say honoring different pathways. We all have different backgrounds, and we sometimes know where we're headed, and sometimes we don't. And there's different places people are headed. So how could one pathway accomplish all of that? It doesn't. So I think that's great. I think in terms of stackable, I've gone. That was a huge oh yeah, this is a great idea. I just don't know how. I really don't know how logistically it's actually going to happen. And I'd like it to happen. I think it makes sense to me. But one of the thoughts that came to mind is, back in the 90s, I was doing a lot in corporate training, and there was the term was a learning organization, that big companies wanted to be a learning organization. And I would say at the time, you're a learning organization when you no longer have training that's outside of the work. That if the learning is part of your work, then you're a learning organization, rather than taking a sabbatical, whether it's for a week or a day or whatever, to go learn somewhere. That if learning just becomes part of the expectation of the job. And I think given the way things are changing so quickly, I think I'd be interested in seeing corporations and universities starting to intertwine more around bringing learning into the workplace as just part of the job, so that there isn't this tension between doing your job and taking time off to learn, or fitting that in amongst your family time and so forth. So well, I want to thank you. Anything more you want to add as a closing comment or thoughts on this subject?
I mean, I think we talked a lot about the younger journey, right, and into education. And I would just sort of flag the adult that journey, as you're saying, in a way, right, continues all the way into adulthood, and we're just very excited to be in that space with the work we're doing in executive education and imbuing that space with new curriculum and new programs that hopefully bring a sense of creativity and transformation to the learner, who is very much leading the way in their industry, but needs that jolt of inspiration and new skills to propel them forward.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Dr. Mariana Amatullo. We really appreciate you joining us, and this has been another Mind Maxing podcast. Thank you very much.